One of the challenge with raising kids is they don't come with a manual. It's been so much easier. A story is told of a young couple that had their first baby, and they finally got to the place after turning down invitation after invitation. Can you come out, get an evening away from your kids? And they said, okay, I think we can do it. And they created a document of all the things. What would happen? Here's our cell, here's this, and if they swallow anything, just phone 911. We will meet you at the hospital. We're not taking any chances. Second kid comes along. Didn't take near as long, as you know, for them to say, look, we got to get out and have a night on our own. Here's the cell. If you need, you can call. If they swallow something, just make a note of it. We'll wait for it to come out the other end. Third kid comes along, takes no time at all. And they said, look, we got to get out. Here's the cell. Phone us if you're desperate. And if that kid swallows another coin, I'm going to deduct it from his allowance this time. Kids. Lots of books have been written on how kids are different. You know, the oldest child, the youngest child, the middle child. I'm a middle child. Just that's really important with the story we're going to today. Older kids, they want to, make mom and dad happy, and the younger one says, well, my older sister's doing that, so I can kind of do my own thing. And we know how that goes. So parents, realize that, you can't stereotype your kids. They're all kids. They're all different. You got to love them differently. But that overriding principle is that we love them. We love them, and we try and instill within them that they know that they are loved by us. Well, this morning we're going to look at a parable that Jesus tells about two brothers that are very different from each other. However, Jesus makes it very clear that they are both deeply loved by the Father. Luke 15 tells the story of what we've typically called the prodigal son. Prodigal meaning extravagant. He was wasteful in the way he spent his father's inheritance. But it could have easily been called the prodigal father because of his extravagance. Or it could be called the parable of the two lost sons, because they're both lost in different ways. So let me set the stage. Who's Jesus talking to? This is all found in Luke 15 if you want to follow along in your Bibles. This is what Luke 15:1 says. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. That's Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man Jesus welcomes sinners and eats with them. So there's this mixed crowd, but they're not mixed. You got one crowd here and one crowd here that's listening to Jesus. Now the tax collectors and sinners are represented by the younger brother in the story that Jesus is about to tell. They're the ones that don't keep the moral laws or observe what they had been raised, maybe generations back. They've left home, so to speak, and left their religious upbringing behind them in a desire to do their own thing. The religious leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, are represented in Jesus' story as the older brother, who represent, they keep the rules. They held on to the traditions that they'd taught since birth. They showed up every Sabbath and did their thing. Now this is one of those stories that you might say, I think I'm a middle child. I'm not the older one, I'm not the younger one, maybe I'm somewhere in the middle. I want to suggest to you as we look at this, that there's part of the younger son in every one of us that wants to do its own thing. And there's part of the older son in every one of us that's okay with the status quo. And there's part of the love of the Father in every one of us. I've used as my resource for this little series that we're going to do Henry Nouwen's work on the prodigal, as well as Tim Keller's. And we'll be unpacking this more in the weeks to come. I'm going to read for you the parable, and I'm reading it from The Voice. And I want you to think of it as kind of an Act 1, an Act 2, and I will intersect little pieces that depict where each scene starts. Luke 15. Once there was this man that had 2 sons. One day the younger son came to his father and said, "Father, eventually I'm going to inherit a share of your estate. Rather than wait until you die, I want you to give it to me now." So the father liquidated assets and divided them. Scene 2. I can do my own thing. A few days passed, and the younger son gathered all his wealth and set off on a journey to a distant land. Once he was there, he wasted everything he owned on wild living. He was broke. A terrible famine set in, and he was desperately hungry and in need. Scene 3. Hits bottom. He got a job with one of the locals who sent him to the field to feed the pigs. The young man felt so miserably hungry that he wished he could eat the slop the pigs were eating. Nobody gave him anything. So he had this moment of self-reflection. What am I doing here? Back home, my father's hired servants have plenty of food. Why am I here starving to death? I'll get up and return to my father. I'll say, "Father, I've done wrong. Wrong against God and wrong against you. I have forfeited any right to be treated like your son. But I'm wondering if you will treat me as one of your hired servants." Next scene, the long walk home. So he got up and returned to the father. The father looked off in the distance and saw the young man returning. He felt compassion for his son and ran out to him, enfolded him in the embrace, and kissed him. The son said, "Father, I've done a terrible wrong in God's sight and your sight too. I have forfeited any right to be called your son." But the father turned to his servants and said, "Quick, bring the best robe we have and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. Go get the fattest calf and butcher it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, because my son was dead and now he's alive again. He was lost and has been found." And they had this huge party. End of Act 1. Act 2. Scene 1. The discovery. Now the man's older son was still out in the fields working. He came home at the end of the day and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant said, "Your brother's returned and your father's butchered the fattest calf to celebrate his safe return." The older brother got very angry and refused to come inside. So his father came out and pleaded with him to join the celebration. But he argued, "Listen, all these years I've worked hard for you. I've never disobeyed one of your orders. But how many times have you given me even a little goat to roast for a party with my friends? Not once. This is not fair. This son of yours, this wasteful delinquent who spent your hard-earned wealth on loose women, and what do? You butcher the fattest calf from our herd?" The father replied, "My son, you've always been with me, and all I have is yours. Isn't it right to celebrate and be happy? This is your brother we're talking about. He was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found again." So let's just dig a little bit deeper. Those 2 crowds. How did they think they heard Jesus' message? The tax collectors and the sinners, they would have said, "Good talk, Jesus. Good. That was encouraging. The religious leaders, not so much. They were offended. They were angry. See, remember, the younger son in the story represents the people that had kind of walked away from their religious upbringing. They had turned their backs on God and what their families may have taught them. The religious tradition would have told them that they are shunned, they are not welcome back. So as they listen to Jesus tell the story, they go, oh, maybe if that son can come back, maybe there's hope for me, that I can find my way back to God. Now, the older son represented the religious leaders, those that stayed faithful and were dutiful. The religious leaders may have thought, the oldest son, he's got every right to be angry the way he treated Dad. What a disgraceful thing for a son to do. They might even have thought, I'm not even sure Dad should have shown that kind of kindness and taken him back. Let's go back to the beginning, the request. Give me a share of the estate. The people that were listening that day would have been shocked to hear that. See, now the younger son would know that one day he would inherit part of his father's estate. That's just the way it worked. They didn't say, well, we're going to give part of it to a charity or anything else. It was all figured out. The oldest son always got a double portion, but then the rest was all divided between, I hate to say this, between the guys individually. All the sons. And the women, the girls. Aren't you glad times changed? But when he sang, like, I know I'm going to get this one day, but I want it now. He knew he'd get it when his father died. But asking for the inheritance now, the father would have had to sell part of his land. He'd have to lay off some of the staff. The younger son is essentially saying, Dad, I want my share of your stuff, but I don't want you in my life. His relationship was about enduring the relationship with his dad until he could get his hands on the money. I want my share now. So the people that were listening, they're just going, I can't believe the son would ask for this. But they're even probably more shocked by the father's response. They would surely expect Jesus to say, and what the father did was have that son beaten and chased off the estate, and the crowd, the community, shunned him and said, you're never welcome back. That's what they would expect him to do. So to their surprise, the father says, okay, I'll sell a third of the land and give you what you want. Have you, I don't know if you've got friends that are indigenous. When you talk to them, if you said, hi Ron, how are you? And I introduce myself, I might say, I'm a Salvation Army officer or something like that. Men typically introduce themselves linking their work to themselves. Women often talk about their families. Our indigenous brothers and sisters always talk about their land, their people, don't they? In the ancient Middle East, they did the very same thing. They would say that the land doesn't belong to them, they belong to the land. So by this son saying to his dad, I want this, my share now, he's essentially ripping He's tearing his dad apart because this land has been in the family for generation after generation. And Jesus, even in the Greek verb that he uses, is very intentional that the people understand this isn't just a transaction that needs to happen. This just strikes right at the heart of the Father. The Father endures a tremendous loss of honor in the community, as well as the path or the pain of rejected love. When our love is rejected, how do we respond? We might get angry, might look for ways to retaliate, we might get bitter. This Father just maintains his love for his Son. So let's continue. Son goes off to a far away country. His life is out of control. He loses everything. He hits bottom and he finds himself in the mud with the pigs. Now, Jesus is very intentional. You know, shepherds were considered kind of the low life. If you were a thief or, had been, you might expect to get a job as a shepherd. We think of David being a shepherd, and it's what a great privilege to be a shepherd. Shepherds, they were, well, maybe we can trust them with the sheep. The only thing worse than being a shepherd would be to take care of pigs. Like that is the bottom of the bottom. So for this Jewish kid that's raised this way, who's never smelt bacon before, to have to feed the pigs, you wonder how much lower can it get for him. You wonder how the religious leaders may have even thought, even that's bad. But when he comes to his senses, Jesus is very particular to say that he recognizes that he has sinned against God. We all know he sinned against his Father, but he sinned against God, and he sinned against his Father. And he realizes he must apologize. And he's not worthy of being called a son. But maybe, just maybe, his Father would hire him as a hired hand. Now, the Father would have had servants as well as hired hands. The servants would have lived there and taken care of some of the domestic things. So, the cleaning, the cooking, and that kind of stuff. They lived on the estate. The hired men would have been the tradespeople, the craftsmen, that would live in the village. They'd be paid a wage. The Son says, if I am on the estate, that just makes it too hard for everybody. I couldn't do that to my dad, because every time he would look at me, he'd be reminded of what I did. Maybe I can learn a trade, an apprentice, and become a tradesperson, and then I can live in a corner of the village. I can show up for work, get paid a wage. My dad doesn't have to see me, and I don't have to, run salt into that wound. But when it comes to the last scene in that first act, the Father sees the Son coming. No, I don't think it was just by chance that the Father says, I wonder what's happening out there today. I imagine several times every day he's looking down the road to see if his Son is coming. And he sees his Son coming. And Jesus says he ran to meet him. Kids run, young men run, women would occasionally run, but patriarchs would never run. Far too distinguished for that. Why'd he run? Well, because of the disgrace that the Son had put his Father through. If any one of the village people would have met the Son coming back into town, they would have had him taken to the gate and stoned before the Father was ever known he returned. The father hikes up whatever they were wearing and he breaks into a run to save his son's life. He's not taking a chance that anybody's going to get there before him. I love these stories of Jesus because you kind of got to read between the lines. You can just think, maybe the servant's coming in with lunch and say, "Where'd the boss go? Is that the boss running down the road? Where's he going? I don't know, but we better catch up." And so, I didn't bring my running shoes, and away they go. They're running down the road. Because we know that because Jesus says in this parable, "Go get a rope. Go back and get a rope." And that was before running became popular. The servant saying, "Okay, I had one run, and I've got to run back and get a robe." What did the robe symbolize? The Father saying, "I'm not going to wait until you earn your way back." Because tradition would have said, when you disgrace your father like that, you got to more than apologize. There has to be retribution. You have to figure out a way to pay your dad back for what you've done. And the dad says, "Not a chance. I'm going to put my robe on you. I'm going to put a ring on your finger. And your status as son, you are right back in the family. I'm not going to wait for you to try and grovel and beg so that you can be forgiven. Forgiven is upon you. You are forgiven. I will cover your nakedness, your poverty, and your rags with my robes and with my honor." We're going to leave it there and we're going to pick it up next week, but if you don't hear anything else today, I want you to hear this. When we think of what that father had to endure, the shame, the humiliation, everything else from that son, and yet he loved him and he welcomed him back in the family. God loves you even more than that. There is nothing you can do that can separate yourself from God's love. It doesn't matter if you turn your back on God and run away. God is still loving you. God will never stop loving you. It is impossible. It is against the very character of God for him to stop loving you. Just go to the next slide for me. The whole of the Christian life is one long journey towards the house of the Father. The whole of the Christian life is one long journey towards the house of the Father, a seeking to know the Father. Bob's going to come and sing. And he's just going to sing a song that reminds us again of the love that the Father has for us. And as Bob sings, I want you can close your eyes, but allow these words to speak to you. Because remember, there's part of that younger son. Next week we'll talk about the older son a bit. Allow these words that speak of the love of God to wash over you. And it could be that you're here today and you're saying, "I'm lonely. I feel all alone." You're not. God loves you more than you can ever imagine. We have this place of prayer here, and if you come and kneel here, that doesn't mean that you've asked your dad for part of the land and you've run off and wasted it. But it is a way of just saying, "Touch me again with your love. Touch me again with your love." I need to experience your love again this day. Allow God to speak to you as Bob sings. If human hearts are often tender, and human minds can pity know, if human love is touched with splendor, and human hands compassion show, then how much more shall God our Father in love forgive, then how much more shall God our Father our wants supply and none deny. If sometimes men can live for others, and sometimes give where gifts are spurned, if sometimes treat their foes as brothers, and love where love is not returned, then how much more shall God our Father in love forgive, then how much more shall God our Father our wants supply and none deny. If men will often share their gladness, if men respond when children cry, if men can feel each other's sadness, each other's tears attempt to dry, then how much more shall God our Father in love forgive, then how much more shall God our Father our wants supply and none deny.